I kept the ledger for the 3rd Battalion, and that is not a job men envy. Warrant Officer Dale Prout, recovery and Graves registration, and what it meant in plain speech was that when a man stopped being a soldier and started being a weight, he became mine. I carried the tags. I carried the list. I had a green canvas book with a brass corner on it, and I wrote the names in that book in pencil first and ink later, because pencil can be lifted and ink cannot. And I had learned early that the difference between those two things is the whole difference between a man's mother getting a letter and a man's mother getting a knock on the door. I was 41 years old that spring. I had done 6 years of it by then, and I had a way of looking at people that other men found unpleasant, and I understood why. I was measuring them. I did not want to, and I could not stop. A man would be laughing in the chow line with his helmet pushed back, and I would be seeing the shape of him under a poncho, seeing where I would have to put my hands. It is a disease of the trade. You look at the living and you see the paperwork. So when they brought the bomb tech across the water to us on the last Tuesday in March, I looked at her the way I looked at everyone, and I want to say now, before I say anything else, that I got it wrong. I got it as wrong as a man can get a thing and still call himself observant. She came over on the ration barge with 3 pallets of tinned meat and a crate of radio batteries, and she came off it carrying her own kit, which was 2 green bags and a hard case with a dented aluminum shell. She was not tall. She had the kind of build you get from work rather than from exercise, thick through the forearms, thick through the back of the hands, and narrow everywhere else, the way a rope is narrow. Her hair was cut short and it was full of dried silt, gray silt, the color of the flats, and there was more of it in the seams of her neck and behind her ears. She had come from somewhere that was mud, and she had not stopped anywhere to wash. She set her bags down on the pier boards, and she looked at the water. That was the first thing I noticed, and it did not mean anything to me then. Everybody who comes to the Marrow looks at the water, because the water at the Marrow is a thing you have to look at twice before you believe it. But she did not look at it the way a new man looks at it. A new man looks at the tide and he sees the water. She looked at it, and I would swear to you she was looking at the road underneath. Because there is a road under the Marrow. That is the whole trouble with the place. The Marrow Causeway is 2.5 miles of stone laid down by somebody dead a long time ago, straight as a rule across the tidal flats from the mainland to the neck of the peninsula, and twice a day the sea comes up over it, and it is not a road anymore. It is a line of water slightly less deep than the water on either side of it. Then the sea goes back out and the causeway comes up steaming and streaming and covered in weed, and for about 9 hours you can drive on it, and then you cannot. Everything we did that spring, every man and every bullet and every crate of meat, went across that stone twice a day or did not go at all. "Warrant," she said, "where do I put my case so it doesn't get walked on?" "Depends what's in it. Things that don't like being walked on." I pointed at the corner of the pier hut where I kept the litters, and she carried the case over and set it down and put a hand flat on the lid for a second the way you would touch a horse before you left it in a strange stall. Then she straightened and put out her hand and said her name, and I took it, and her hand was hard and dry and cold. "Vane," she said, "Marisol Vane disposal." "Prude." She waited about half a beat, the way people do when they expect the second half of the sentence. "Graves," I said. Most people flinch. It is a small flinch and they cover it. She did not. She nodded once and something went behind her eyes, some quick calculation, and then she said, "Then I hope we don't have much to talk about." And she picked up her bags and went up the pier toward the vehicle park, and I stood there with my hand still half out and I thought, well, that is a hard woman. I want to be honest about what I thought next, because if I clean it up now, then the whole rest of this is worthless. I thought they've sent us a problem. I did not think it because she was a woman, though I would be lying if I said that had nothing to do with it, and I have had 40 years to look at that lie and I am not going to tell it here. I thought it because of the silt. Because a soldier who arrives with another place's mud still on her means she left that place in a hurry, and people leave places in a hurry for two reasons. Either something happened to them, or something happened because of them. And I had heard, the way you hear things, that there had been a place called Ashgrove. Nobody would say her call sign out loud. That was the first strange thing, and it took me 4 days to notice it, and I only noticed it because of Sergeant Okonkwo, who ran the wire section and who had been in the service since before I could shave. We were sitting on the tailgate of a truck eating out of tins, and down the line, out past the last strand of the perimeter, Vane was walking the shoulder of the causeway with a long steel probe, going slow, putting the tip of the probe in the ground every 18 inches like she was planting something. She had been doing that for 2 days. She started at the gate and she went out along the stone as far as the water would let her. And when the tide came up, she stopped and sat down on the wall and watched it come. And when it went out, she started again from where she'd stopped. "She's not looking for mines," Okonkwo said. "That's exactly what she's doing. She's looking for where the mines are going to be." He tipped his tin up and drank the oil out of the bottom of it and wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist. "Two different jobs. You want to know which one you're watching, look at where her eyes go. She's not looking at the probe, she's looking at the road." I watched. He was right. Her hands were doing the probe work with no more attention than a woman shelling peas, and her head was up, and she was reading the surface of that stone the way I would read a page. "You know her," I said. "I know of her." Okonkwo set the tin down on the tailgate very carefully, like the tin was fragile, and it was not. "You do too, Warrant. You just don't know that you do." "Ashgrove," I said. He looked at me for a second, and then he looked away, out at the flats, and the flats that afternoon were the color of a wet blade, mile on mile of them, with the sky lying down flat on top of them and no line between the two. "Ashgrove," he said. Here is what I knew about Ashgrove, and I want to set it down the way I knew it then, which is to say wrong, because most of what I knew then was wrong. I knew that 18 months before, on a road in a different country, a supply column had gone into a valley and the road behind it had come apart. Not a single charge. A chain, a whole line of them, laid in sequence, wired to a single emitter somewhere up on the high ground. And the way it had been done was that the enemy had let the column come in and then started the chain at the far end and walked it back, so that every vehicle that turned around to run went into a fresh crater, and the ones that stopped got the one under them. 31 vehicles in 4 minutes. It was the kind of thing that got taught afterward at every school in the service, and the reason it got taught was that it had been stopped. Somebody had gone into that valley on foot while the chain was still live. Somebody had found the emitter by working backward along the wire, device to device, in daylight, with the enemy watching, and had cut the chain from the wrong end, the dangerous end, the armed end, and had taken it apart charge by charge until there was nothing left to walk. That was the story. That was all it was to me then. A story you heard at a school. And the way I had heard it, the person who did it had a call sign, and the call sign was Kestrel, and I had assumed for 18 months, without ever once examining the assumption, that Kestrel was a man. "That's her," I said. "That's her. Then why is she here?" Okonkwo picked his tin back up and turned it in his hands, and he was quiet long enough that I thought he was not going to answer. "Because 17 men died in that valley before she got there," he said. "And there are people in this army who have decided that the number they remember is 17. He got down off the tailgate. "Nobody says her call sign," he said, "because if you say it, you have to have an opinion about it, and most men would rather not." The culvert took Corporal Bright and Private Deacon on the 11th of April, at 10 minutes past 6 in the morning, on a falling tide. I have to be careful here. This is the part of it that I have gone over the most, and that means it is the part I trust the least, because a memory you handle every day gets worn smooth like a coin, and you stop being able to read the face of it. So I am going to tell you only what I saw, and what I saw is this. The culvert was at the 1100-meter mark, out on the stone, where the causeway crossed a channel that ran under it. It had been there as long as the road had. Every vehicle we ran went over it 4 times a day and had done for 6 weeks. And at 10 past 6 that morning, a water truck went over it, and the road went up. I was at the gate. I heard it before I understood it, a hard, flat crack, no roll to it, the sound of a door slamming inside a mountain. And then the pressure came down the stone and hit the gate hut and blew the maps off my table. When I got outside, there was a column of gray silt standing over the causeway 100 feet high, going up and starting to lean, and the water truck was in the channel on its side with its wheels turning. Bright was dead in the cab. Deacon was in the water and was dead by the time we got a rope on him. That is the whole of it. 2 men, 1 charge, 6 minutes. But that is not the part that matters. The part that matters is what Vane did in the next hour, and how it looked was bad. She was on the road inside of 4 minutes. She had been sleeping in the vehicle park in her boots, which I did not know yet was her habit. And she went past me at the gate at a hard walk, not a run, carrying her case, and she said one thing to me as she went, and what she said was, "Don't send anyone after them." There were men going out. Of course there were men going out. Deacon was in the water and there were men from his section already 30 meters onto the stone at a dead sprint, and she got in front of them, one woman with her arms out, and she stopped them. "Off the stone," she said. "All of you off the stone now. Deacon's in the water. Then he is in the water and you cannot help him, and if you go out there, you will be in the water with him." I heard that. I heard her say it. And I want you to hear what I heard, which was a woman standing between us and 2 dying men and telling us not to go. Sergeant Nash of the engineers came up on her, and he was a big man, and he was 3 inches from her face, and he was screaming. And she did not move, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not blink, and she said, "There is more than one. You don't know that. Sergeant, the water in that channel is going out at 4 knots, and there is a device under the road 40 meters short of the crater, and if you run past it, it will kill you. And then I will have to explain to your colonel why I let you." And Nash said, and I heard this too, and it is the sentence that started everything that came after. Nash said, "Then how do you know where it is?" That is the question. That is the whole question. That is the question that 18 months of Ashgrove had planted in this army like a seed, and it came up out of Nash's mouth that morning on the causeway with 2 men still warm in the water, and once it was out, you could not put it back. How does she always know where they are? Vane looked at him for what felt like a long time, and was probably 2 seconds. "Because I have been walking this road for 11 days, she said, "and I know what it looks like when it has been dug." Then she went out on the stone alone. She was out there for 5 hours. The tide came up and she came back to the wall and sat and waited, and it went out again and she went back. And in 5 hours she took 2 devices out of that road, one at 1160 and one at 1080, and she carried them in, one at a time in her hands, walking slow, and she laid them on a tarp behind the gate hut, and she knelt over them for a long time without touching them. I went and stood behind her. I do not know why. It was not my business. They did not look like anything. That is the thing nobody tells you. They looked like 2 lumps of packed clay with wire coming out of them, and a battery taped to the side, and one of them had a piece of green plastic sheet folded around it that had come off a ration crate, our ration crate, and she was looking at the fold in that plastic like a man reads a letter. "Warrant," she said, without turning around. "Yes." "You wrote them up already." She meant Bright and Deacon. "Yes." "What time did you put on the sheet?" 6:10. She nodded slowly. She reached out and turned the second device with one finger, an inch, and looked at the underside of it, and then she sat back on her heels. "They were armed in the wrong order," she said. I did not know what that meant. I did not ask, and I have thought since that if I had asked, If I had been the kind of man who asked instead of the kind who wrote, then the next 4 days would have gone another way entirely, and 11 hours of a woman's life in the mud would not have been necessary, and I would not be sitting here at 81 years old telling this to you. But I did not ask. I went inside and I opened my green book and I wrote Bright T and Deacon R in pencil, and I went to find the colonel to have him sign the sheet. Colonel Ridgway was not a stupid man. I want that on the record, because it would be easy, and it would be false to make him into a fool, and he was not a fool. He was a tired man with 340 soldiers on the wrong side of a road that vanished twice a day, and he had just lost 2 of them, and he was frightened, and frightened men look for a reason the way a drowning man looks for the bottom. He held the board in the mess tent on the 12th. It was not a real board. A real board takes weeks. This was 6 officers and a folding table and a lamp, and it took 4 hours, and I was there because the Graves man is always there. They had her stand. They did not give her a chair. That is the detail I would like you to hold on to, because everything else that happened in that tent came out of it. They had her stand for 4 hours at the end of a folding table, in her working uniform with the silt still on the knees of it, and every officer in that tent was sitting down. Nash gave his account, and it was honest and it was ruinous. He said she had stopped him from going to Deacon. He said she had known where the second device was before she had looked for it. He said, and I watched him say it, and I watched him believe it, that in 11 days she had been out on that stone alone for something over 60 hours, at all hours in the dark, with no escort and no log, and that nobody had ever gone with her, and that nobody knew what she did out there. Major Lyle of the disposal cell gave his account next, and Lyle was the man who should have defended her, and did not. Lyle was the senior bomb officer in the sector, and he had been in the trade for 19 years, and he had spent every one of those 19 years being extremely good and entirely unheard of. And 18 months ago a staff sergeant had walked backward up a live chain in a valley and become a story that men told at schools. Lyle did not say a single untrue word. He said that Staff Sergeant Vane's methods were, in his professional assessment, unorthodox. He said she declined to work with a number 2. He said she did not follow the standard render-safe procedure and had not for some time. He said that the search she was conducting on the causeway had not been ordered by him and had not been logged with him, and that he had asked her 3 times for her survey notes and had not received them. That last one was true, and there was a reason for it, and the reason was so simple that when I learned it, 4 days later, standing in mud up to my thighs, I had to put my hand on a truck to stay upright. The reason was that she did not have any notes. She did not have notes because she had not found anything to note, because what she had been doing for 11 days on that stone was not a survey, it was a baseline. She was memorizing what the road looked like when it was clean. That was the whole method. That was Ashgrove, and that was everything. She did not find bombs by looking for bombs. She found them by knowing, to a degree that no ordinary man could credit, and therefore no ordinary man did credit, what the ground looked like when there was nothing in it. You cannot write that down. There is no form for it. 19 years of standard procedure has no box on it that says I have looked at this road 400 times and I would know if you moved 1 stone. So when Ridgway asked her, at the end of 4 hours, standing at the end of the table with her hands at her sides, "Staff Sergeant, how did you know where the second device was?" She gave him the only answer she had. "Because the road was different, sir." You could hear the lamp hissing. "Different how?" "The weed on the stone at 1080 was lying east," she said. "Everywhere else on that stretch it lies west. It has lain west every day since I arrived, because the ebb runs west through that channel. Something had turned it over and put it back. That was the only place on 1100 meters of road where the weed was lying the wrong way, sir, and I saw it 4 days ago, and I did not report it, and I should have." She stopped, and then she said the thing that finished her. "I did not report it because I was not certain, And if I had reported every uncertainty I have had on that road, you would have closed the causeway for 11 days and this battalion would have starved. So I watched it. And I was wrong to watch it, and Corporal Bright and Private Deacon are dead, and I will carry that. I have replayed that 400 times. She was telling the truth. She was telling the exact, complete, disciplined truth, and she was taking the weight of it in front of 6 seated officers without one word of defense. And what 6 seated officers heard was, "I knew, and I said nothing, and 2 men died." Ridgway sat back. He put his pencil down on the table very gently, and he looked at her for a while, and I saw a decent man arrive at a coward's conclusion, because it was the one that let him sleep. "You are relieved of survey duties on this crossing," he said. "Major Lyle's cell assumes them. You will not go onto the causeway without an officer. You will not go onto the causeway at night. You will surrender your case to the cell for inventory." She said, "Sir." "You'll go back across on the barge Thursday. There'll be a formal board on the mainland." She said, "Sir." And then Ridgway said the last thing, and he said it looking down at the table, not at her, and I have never been able to decide whether that made it better or worse. "For what it's worth, Staff Sergeant," he said, "I don't think you're a coward and I don't think you're a fool. I think you are a woman who has been told she's a legend, and I think you have started to believe it, and I think that is how men die." She stood there a moment longer. "That's a fair thing to think, sir," she said. "It's just not true." Then she picked up nothing because they had taken her case, and she walked out of that tent past me, and her face was as flat and gray and unreadable as the flats themselves. And as she went by me she said, quiet, not stopping, "Warrant, don't let them run the withdrawal on a rising tide." I did not understand that either. I have spent 40 years understanding it. The order to withdraw the forward elements came on the 14th, and it came because the enemy had started shelling the neck of the peninsula, and Ridgway was not going to lose a company to a map. It was the right call. I want to say that plainly. Pulling back off that neck was the right call, and any officer would have made it, and I would have made it. The problem was the water. We had 206 men, 19 vehicles, and 1 road, and the road was under 6 feet of sea until 1440 and would go back under at 2110, and that gave us 6.5 hours to move everything we had across 2.5 miles of stone. 6.5 hours is enough if nothing goes wrong. It is enough with an hour to spare. Nothing went wrong for 4 hours. That was the cruelty of it. 4 hours of trucks rolling out of the neck onto the wet stone, tires throwing water, men walking beside them in file, and me at the gate with a clipboard counting them off, and the tide going out and out until you could see the flats for miles, gray and shining, with the channels cut through them like veins, and out at the horizon a line of white where the sea was waiting. At 1850, the third-to-last serial was at the 1,400-meter mark, and the lead truck of it went nose down into a hole that had not been there in the morning. No bang. That is what I want you to understand. There was no explosion. The stone had simply been cut, undermined from the channel side, hollowed out under the surface so that the crust of it held a man and did not hold 9 tons, and when the truck went through, it went through into the channel, and it jammed there sideways, blocking 2/3 of the road, and the causeway at that point is 4.5 meters wide. You could not get past it. You could not get a recovery vehicle up to it because the recovery vehicle was on the wrong side, and the tide turned at 1902. I have been in some situations. I have never in my life seen fear move through a body of men the way it moved down that stone in the next 20 minutes. It did not come as noise. It came as silence, 200 men on a road in the sea, all doing the same arithmetic at the same time, all arriving at the same number. Ridgway got up there at 1920. I went with him, and when we got to the truck, Vane was already under it. She should not have been on the stone at all. She was on the stone because she had walked out of the vehicle park when the first man shouted, and nobody had stopped her, and she was flat on her back in 8 inches of returning water with her shoulders under the running gear of a 9-ton truck, doing something with her hands that I could not see. Ridgway said her name. She did not come out. Staff Sergeant Vane. Sir, there is a device wired to the axle, and I am 4 minutes from having it off, and if you shout at me again, I will lose count. I watched Colonel Ridgway's mouth open and close. And then Sergeant Nash, who had never gotten over it, Nash, who had watched Deacon drown, said the sentence that ended it, and he said it in front of the colonel, and he said it loud enough for 40 men to hear. How does she always know, sir? That is all it was. That is all it took. 9 words on a road with the sea coming in. Ridgway looked out at the horizon. The white line was closer. In 65 minutes there would be a meter of water on the stone, and in 90 there would be 3, and he had 140 men still to the east of a jammed truck, and he had a woman under it that half his battalion had decided was the reason their friends were dead. Get her out from under there, he said. 2 men pulled her out by the ankles. She came out on her back in the water, and she came up onto her knees, and she was covered to the chest in gray silt, and there was a line of blood running from her hairline down the side of her jaw, and she still had a spanner in her right hand. Sir, she said, it is 4 minutes. You are not touching that vehicle. Sir, if you push it into the channel it will detonate, and it will take the road with it. Major Lyle's cell will handle it. Major Lyle's cell is on the mainland, sir. There is no one out here but me. And Ridgway and I was standing close enough to touch him, and I saw his face, and God help me I understood him, Ridgway said. Then it stays where it is. Dismount the trucks, everybody walks, push the vehicle off the road and walk. She stood up out of the water. Sir, if you push that truck off the road, you will put a live charge into the channel 40 meters short of the culvert, and there is a second chain under this causeway. And I have been trying to tell you for 3 days that they laid it in reverse, and the first device is the last one they arm, and it is not under the truck, it is under the road behind you. Nobody moved. Behind me, Ridgway said. Between here and the gate, sir, somewhere in 1100 meters. I have not found it because you took my case and you took my road and you would not let me walk it at night, and night is when they lay them. And Colonel Ridgway looked at a staff sergeant standing in the rising sea, bleeding from the head, with silt in her teeth, telling him that the ground he had just walked over with 100 men on it was going to open up, and he made the decision that a frightened man makes, which is the decision that requires the least courage in the next 10 seconds and the most for the rest of his life. Push it off, he said. March them out now. She said, Sir, I am asking you. Warrant Officer Prout. Sir, Staff Sergeant Vane is under arrest. Put a man on her and bring her out with the last serial. And that was the order. That is the order, exactly as it was given, and I have never had to lie about it because I have never been asked. Here is what happened in the next 40 minutes, and I will tell it as flatly as I can, because if I dress it up I will not get through it. They pushed the truck off the stone. It went into the channel and it did not go off. Somebody cheered. I remember that. Somebody actually cheered. They marched the men out. 140 men in file at a hard pace, west into the dark, with the water coming up over their boots and then over their ankles and then over their shins, and the trucks abandoned behind them and the last light going out of the west. And at the 900-meter mark, in 18 inches of water in the dark, the road went up. Not one charge, 4. 4 charges in sequence walking west to east toward the men, not away from them. And the reason it walked that way is the reason she had been trying to give a colonel for 3 days. And the reason is that if you arm a chain in reverse and fire it from the wrong end, everyone who runs the way they think is safe runs into it. 19 men went into the water. We got 14 back. And in the confusion, in the shouting and the flares and men going into channels, and coming out of them and me on my knees on the stone, hauling a boy up by his webbing. The man Ridgway had put on Vane lost her. He did not lose her. I want to be accurate. He was struck in the shoulder by a piece of the road and he went down, and when he came up he could not find her, and he looked, and I believe he looked, and the water was coming and somebody grabbed him and pulled him west and he went, and he was 20 years old. Vane went east. 2 men saw her. Both told me the same thing afterward, and neither of them ever changed a word of it. She came up out of the water after the 4th charge, and she stood for a second, and she looked west at the men and east at the flats, and she made a choice. And then she went east, away from the road, out onto the flats, into the dark, alone, on foot, on a rising tide, toward a truck in a channel with a live charge wired to the axle of it, and a wounded engineer named Corporal Halsey pinned in the cab. Nobody followed her. I want to be very clear about this, and then I want to never say it again. Nobody followed her, and I was one of the nobodies. I was on the stone with 14 wet men and a broken road and my clipboard in my hand and a colonel screaming at me to move, and the water was at my knees, and I turned west and I walked, and I did not go back. We came off the causeway at 21:40, an hour and a half after the road had gone under. The last 200 meters we did in water to our chests, holding onto a rope, and every man who came off that stone came off it as a man who had left something behind. I set up in the gate hut. I lit 2 lamps. I got the clipboard out and I started the count, because that is the job, and the job does not care what you have just done. It took me until 2:30 in the morning. 206 had gone out. 201 came back off the stone. 4 bodies came in with them. That left 1. I sat in that hut with the sea hammering on the wall outside and the lamps guttering, and I opened the green canvas book with the brass corner on it, and I turned to the page, and I put the pencil down. Vane M. Staff Sergeant, Explosive Ordnance Disposal. I wrote 14 April. I wrote Marrow Causeway. And then there is a column on that page that says disposition, and in that column, for a man you cannot bring in and cannot bury, there is 1 entry you are permitted to make, and it is 3 words long. I sat there for a very long time. Then I wrote, missing presumed dead. And I want to tell you what that felt like, and I find that after 40 years I still do not have the words for it, so I will tell you what I did instead, which is that I closed the book and I put my forehead down on the cover of it, and I stayed like that until the lamp ran out of oil. Dawn on the 15th came up gray and low. The tide had turned at 2, and by 6 the flats were coming out of the water again, mile on mile of them, steaming, and the causeway lay across them broken in 4 places like a snapped bone. Ridgway had the battalion on the mainland, and no way to bring it home. That is what nobody had understood at 1920 the night before, and it was the whole of it. We were not trapped on the peninsula. We had gotten off the peninsula. What we could not do was get anywhere, because the Marrow Causeway was the only road out of the mainland pocket, as well 2.5 miles east to the neck, and 11 miles west to the pass, and the western road ran through the Culmer Cut, and the Culmer Cut had been shelled shut on the 12th. So there we were, 340 men, 4 bodies, 150 wounded and walking wounded, and 1 road, and under that road somewhere, a chain of devices laid in reverse by an enemy who had been 3 days ahead of us the entire time. At 8 in the morning, Ridgway held an O group in the gate hut, and I stood at the back of it with my book under my arm. Major Lyle had come over on the first barge. He had 4 men and 2 mine detectors and 19 years of standard render-safe procedure, and he stood in front of a wall map with a pointer in his hand, and he told a colonel the truth, which was, "Sir, to clear 2.5 miles of causeway to standard, working 2 shifts, with the tide taking 9 hours a day out of us, 11 days, possibly 9. I will not do it faster, and I will not tell you I can." Ridgway said, "We have 4 days of rations." "Yes, sir." "The cut opens when?" Engineers say 16 days. And Colonel Ridgway put both hands flat on the table and looked down at the map of a road he could not use. And I watched him understand, completely and finally and 11 hours too late, exactly what he had thrown into the sea. Nobody said anything. Nobody was ever going to say anything. That is how an army works. And then a private named Ferris put his head in the door of the gate hut and said, in a voice that did not sound like a voice, "Sir, there's something moving on the road." We went out to the wall, all of us, 20 officers and a Graves man, and behind us, in about 90 seconds, most of a battalion, because word goes through men faster than any order ever written. Ferris handed the colonel his field glasses and pointed east, out along the stone, into the mist that sat on the flats every morning after the tide, and I put my hand up over my eyes and looked, and I could not see anything, and then I could. 1,100 meters out on the causeway, something was crawling. It was moving west toward us, and it was moving very slowly, and it was low, and for a long horrible moment I thought it was an animal. And then it stopped, and it knelt up, and it was a human being, and it stayed kneeling for a while, doing something with its hands, and then it went back down on its belly and moved forward about 10 feet and stopped again. Ridgway had the glasses. He did not lower them. His hands began to shake, and the glasses shook with them, and he did not lower them. "Sir," Lyle said. "It's her," Ridgway said. And nobody moved. 300 men on a wall in the gray morning, and nobody moved, and nobody spoke, and the only thing you could hear was the water in the channels going out. I am going to tell you now what she did that night, and I am able to tell you because she told it once 4 days later to a board of officers, in a flat voice, in about 9 minutes, and I was in that room with my book on my knees, and I wrote every word of it down. She went east because Halsey was in the truck. That is all. That is the entire reason. There was no plan and no strategy in it. A corporal named Halsey was pinned in the cab of a 9-ton truck in a channel with a live charge wired to the axle of it, and every man on that road was going west, and she was the only person alive who could take that charge off, and so she went east. She got to the truck at about 9 at night in the dark, in water to her waist and rising. She had no case, no tools, no light. She had a spanner in her right hand that she had been holding when they pulled her out from under the running gear, and she had it still, and I have thought many times that if she had dropped that spanner, we would all have died on that road. She took the charge off the axle by feel in the dark in water in 11 minutes. She said that at the board. 11 minutes. Lyle, sitting at the end of the table, put his face in his hands. Then she got Halsey out of the cab. His leg was broken in 2 places, and the cab was flooding, and she got him out through the windscreen and up onto the underside of the truck, which was the only thing above water in 1,000 meters in any direction. And the 2 of them sat on the belly of that truck in the dark, and the wind for 4 hours with the sea coming up under them, and the fires burning on the road to the west. And in those 4 hours, sitting on the hull of a dead truck holding a dying man's head out of the water, Marisol Vane figured it out. She had the chain now. She had held 2 of them in her hands after the culvert. She had seen the fold of the green plastic sheet. And the fold was the thing. The fold told her whose crate it came from, and therefore when it was taken, and therefore when they had been on the road. And now she had a 3rd one in her lap, the one off the axle, and she could feel in the dark with her fingers what she had not been able to prove in the light with a form. They were laid in reverse. Every device on that causeway had been laid west to east, from the gate outward, and armed east to west, from the outside in. Which meant that the last one they had laid, the one out at the far end, the one at the neck, the one nobody would ever get to, was the first one armed. And the first one they had laid, the one nearest the gate, nearest our wire, nearest 340 sleeping men, was the last one armed, and it had not been armed yet, because they were still waiting for us to walk over it. The whole road was a rifle, and it was loaded from the muzzle. And here is the thing she understood on the belly of that truck at 1 o'clock in the morning that Major Lyle, with his 19 years and his standard procedure, had not understood and would not have understood in 11 days. The chain could only be taken apart from the wrong end, from the armed end, from the east, because they were wired in sequence, one to the next, and every one of them was a switch for the next one down the line. And if you started at the gate, at the safe end, at the sensible end, the end any manual in any army in the world would tell you to start at, the first one you cut would arm every single device between you and the sea. You had to walk it backward. You had to start at the far end, at the neck, 2.5 miles out on a road that would be under 6 feet of water in 4 hours, and you had to come home along it on your hands and knees, taking them out one at a time in the order they would kill you. Which is exactly, precisely, in every particular, what she had done in a valley 18 months before, and which is exactly, precisely, in every particular, the reason no one had believed her. Because a woman who has done an impossible thing once is a woman who has gotten lucky once, and a woman who says she can do it again is a woman who believes her own legend. And I truly think, that if she had never gone to Ashgrove at all, Ridgway would have listened to her on the causeway and Bright and Deacon, and 19 men in the water would be alive. She left Halsey on the truck at 2 in the morning when the tide turned. She went east first, away from us, 2.5 miles east, wadding and swimming and walking with the water going out around her, to the far end of the causeway where it climbs the neck, and she got there at about 4, and she found the first device, the last one laid, the first one armed, sitting in the road under 3 inches of weed exactly where the weed was lying the wrong way, and she took it apart in the dark with a spanner in her hands. Then she turned around and started home. 11 devices. That is the number, and I have had to say it out loud to people who did not believe it, and I will say it here. 11 devices in 11 hours on her hands and knees, across 2.5 miles of tidal causeway, on a falling tide and then a rising one, alone, with no tools and no light and no case and no water and no second man. With a spanner and a pocket knife and a 2-foot length of copper wire, she stripped out of the truck's harness before she left it. I have been asked how she found them. I have been asked that at 3 formal boards and by 4 writers and by every young officer who has ever heard the story and wanted a technique out of it, some trick, some instrument, and I have to tell them all the same thing, which is that there was no trick. She found them because she knew what the road looked like clean. 11 days of walking a stone road with a steel probe, being watched and mocked and reported for it. And every one of those 11 days she had been building the only tool that could have saved us. A picture, held in a human head, of 2.5 miles of causeway, stone by stone, weed by weed, at every state of the tide, in the sun and in the rain. Number 4 was under a slab that had been lifted and put back down. She saw it because the mortar dust on the seam was on the wrong side. Number 6 was in the channel wall, and she found it because a barnacle colony that had been under the water line for 20 years was above it. Number 9 was buried in the road bed, and she never saw it at all. She found it by the smell. She said that at the board, and I watched 2 colonels look at each other, because wet clay that has been out of the ground for 2 days smells different from wet clay that has not. And she had been on her hands and knees with her face 6 inches off that stone for 9 hours, and by then, she said, she could smell the difference, the way you can smell a coin. And with each one she took out, the next one down the line went from armed to safe, and the road behind her got a little longer and a little quieter, and she crawled west into it. The tide turned against her at 9 in the morning. She had 4 left. She said at the board that she thought about stopping. She said she got to number 8, and the water was coming across the stone in sheets, and she sat back on her heels and she thought about walking the last mile in and letting Lyle's cell have the rest. And I am glad she said that, because it is the only human thing in the entire account, and without it, I do not think anyone would have believed a word of it. And then she said why she didn't. Because I couldn't tell them which 4 were left, she said. There's no way to write it down. If I'd come in and they'd sent men out with a map, the map would have been wrong by 6 inches, and 6 inches is the whole thing. I was the only person on Earth who knew where they were, and if I'd stopped, the knowledge would have stopped with me. Then she went back down on her knees in the water, and she did the last 4. She came off the stone at 11 minutes past 9, and she came off it carrying Corporal Halsey on her back. She had gone back for him. That is the part they never get right when they tell it. Somewhere in the middle of the chain, between number 6 and number 7, on the way west, she had gone back east a mile and a half against the tide to get a corporal with a broken leg off the belly of a sunken truck, and then she had carried him. She was 5 foot 4 inches tall, and he was 180 pounds. She had carried him west along a road she had cleared and put him down on the stone every 100 meters while she did the next device, and picked him up again and gone on. 11 hours. 340 men stood on that wall and watched the last 200 meters of it, and not one of us said a word. She came up out of the mist. That is how it looked. The flats were steaming and the mist was lying on the stone about waist high, and she came up out of it slowly, the way a thing comes up out of water, and the first thing you saw was Halsey's head over her shoulder, and then her head, and then she was on the road in front of the gate and she was walking. Every part of her was gray. Her uniform, her hands, her hair, her face. She was the color of the flats, head to foot, packed and cracked with it, and her palms were laid open across the heels, and the blood had gone through the silt in 2 black lines down her wrists. There was a spanner sticking out of the top of her boot. She was not carrying anything else in the world. She walked to the gate. 2 medics ran out and took Halsey off her back, and she let them, and she stood there for a second without him and swayed, and put a hand out and put it on the gate post and steadied. And then she straightened up, and she looked for the ranking officer, and she found him, and she walked up to Colonel Ridgway, and she stopped 4 feet in front of him. And she said, "Sir, the causeway is clear. 11 devices. There may be a 12th at the neck under the water, but I don't think so. I'd send the vehicles over on the low tide, and I'd walk a man in front of each one for the first 400 meters, because I did the first 4 in the dark and I want to look at them again in the light." Then she said, "Corporal Halsey needs a surgeon, sir." That was all. That was everything she said. There was no other word, no reproach, no accusation, no "I told you," nothing about the board or the arrest or the man who had lost her in the water or the order that had left her on the wrong side of a rising sea. A staff sergeant made her report to her colonel and asked for a surgeon for her corporal. And Colonel Ridgway stood there with 340 men behind him and his mouth open and nothing coming out of it. And then his right hand came up. I saw it start. I was 6 feet away and I saw his hand start up off his side, and I do not believe he decided to do it. I think it went up on its own, the way a man's hand goes to a burn. It came up and it went to the brim of his cap and it stopped there. And it stayed. He could not get it down. I want to tell you exactly what that looked like, because it is the last thing I have to give you, and I have carried it for 40 years, and I am going to set it down now and be finished with it. Colonel Ridgway of the 3rd Battalion stood at the Marrow Gate in the gray morning with his hand at the brim of his cap, saluting a staff sergeant covered head to foot in gray silt with her hands laid open and a spanner in her boot. And his hand shook, and his arm shook, and his face came apart, and he held that salute for 11 seconds, and he could not put his hand down. And behind him, without one word of command, without a single order given, without an officer or a sergeant or a warrant saying anything at all, 340 men came to attention on the wall. You could hear it. It went down the wall like a wave breaking, boots on stone, 100 at a time, and then it stopped, and there was no sound anywhere on that whole gray coast except the water going out of the channels. Vane looked at him. She did not smile. She did not straighten. She was too tired to stand up properly, and she did not try. She put her right hand up, silt and blood and all, and she returned it. And then she said, "Sir, the surgeon," and Ridgway made a sound I have never forgotten and will not try to describe, and turned around and started screaming for a surgeon. That is the end of what happened. What is left is what it did. They ran the battalion across the Marrow Causeway that afternoon on the low tide, 19 vehicles and 340 men, and they walked a man in front of each truck for the first 400 meters exactly as she said, and there was no 12th device, and nobody died. Major Lyle went out with the first serial and walked the whole 2.5 miles on foot, alone, looking at what she had done. He came back at dusk, and he did not speak to anyone that night. 2 weeks later, he requested that the board's findings be reopened, and he gave testimony that ran to 9 pages, and the first line of it, I have a copy of it in a drawer in this house. The first line of it says, I was asked for my professional assessment of Staff Sergeant Vane's methods, and I gave it, and it was accurate, and it was worthless, and 2 men are dead because of the difference. Colonel Ridgway wrote his own statement. He did not soften one word of it. He wrote down the order he gave on the causeway at 1920, and he wrote down that he gave it because he was frightened, and because a sergeant asked him a question in front of his men, and he wrote down that he left a soldier on a rising tide and marked her lost, and then he wrote a sentence that I think cost him more than his career, which was, she was right, and I knew she was right, and I could not afford for her to be right in front of the battalion. He resigned his commission in the autumn. Nobody made him. Halsey kept the leg. He was a schoolteacher for 31 years in a town I have never been to, and he wrote to her every April on the 15th for the rest of his life. And he told me once that he never knew what to put in the letters, and so mostly he just put down what he had done that year, so that she would know it had been used. And Marisol Vane, Kestrel, which nobody had said out loud in 11 days, and which every man in that battalion said out loud that afternoon on the stone, went back to work. That is all. She went to the mainland, and she was cleared, and she went back out on another road somewhere and knelt down on it and started learning what it looked like clean. She served 9 more years. She retired a chief warrant officer. She lived, and that matters to me, that she lived, because so much of my trade is men who didn't. She died in her own bed at 78 years old with her family around her, which is a thing I did not think I would ever get to write about anybody in this story. I went to the funeral. I was old by then. There were perhaps 60 people, and most of them had no idea who she had been, because she had not told them, because she never told anybody anything. And I stood at the back with my hat in my hands, and I did not say a word to a single one of them. But before I left the coast, before any of the rest of it, on the afternoon of the 15th of April, while the battalion was crossing the Marrow, I went into the gate hut alone, and I shut the door. I opened the green canvas book with the brass corner on it. I turned to the page, and there it was, in my own handwriting in pencil, thank God, in pencil. Vane M. Staff Sergeant, Explosive Ordnance Disposal, missing, presumed dead. I got the eraser out of my breast pocket, and I sat there for a long while with it in my hand, because I have taken a great many names out of that book over the years. You do. You take them out when they turn up in a hospital or a ditch or a column that got lost for 3 days, and I had never in my life had to think about it before. It was just a job. Lift the pencil, brush the page, write the next one. But I could not make myself do it quickly. I sat in that hut with the sun coming through the one window and the trucks going by on the stone outside, and I thought about a woman on her hands and knees in the dark on a road, smelling the clay, going west, alone, coming home to a battalion that had left her, so that we could drive over the place where she had been. And then I rubbed her name out of the Book of the Dead. I have done a great many things in 81 years, and most of them do not survive the telling. But I will tell you this, and then I will stop. There is a page in a green canvas book in a museum in a city I have not been to since. And on that page, if you know where to look, there is a faint gray shadow where a name used to be, because pencil never comes all the way off. Not really. It stays in the fiber of the paper, and you can always see where the wrong thing was written. I hope they never fix it. I hope some young man comes along someday and looks at that page and sees that shadow and asks somebody what it was. And I hope whoever is standing next to him says the truth, which is, that is where we were wrong about her. And we did not find out until she carried it back to us out of the sea. She carried the two devices in from the culvert one at a time, and I have never told anybody how long that took her, because the number sounds wrong when you say it. 2 hours and 10 minutes to walk 1,100 meters twice. You do not run with them. That is the first thing, and it is obvious once you have seen it, and it is not obvious before. You do not run. You do not hurry. You do not swing your arms, and you do not carry them against your body, because a man's body moves when he breathes, and a device does not care that you were only breathing. She carried them out in front of her at the level of her belt, in 2 hands, cupped, the way a woman carries a bowl too full to set down, and she put 1 foot down and then the other foot down, and she did not look up at us once in 1,100 meters. There is a photograph of that, taken by a corporal in the wire section who had a camera he was not supposed to have, and the photograph is famous now and it is in books, and I want to say what is wrong with it. In the photograph she looks calm. Everybody who sees it says that. Look at her. Look how calm she is. But I was standing at the gate and I could see what a camera at 400 meters could not, and what I could see was her jaw. She had her back teeth set so hard that the muscle stood out under her ear like a rope, and it stayed that way the whole 1,100 meters, and when she got to the tarp and knelt and laid the first one down, she had to open her mouth with her hand. That is not calm. I want that understood, because for 40 years men have used that photograph to say that she was some kind of machine, that she felt nothing, that her nerve was a thing she was born with and therefore nothing to be admired. And I have never in my life been so certain of anything as I am, that she was frightened out of her mind for 2 hours and 10 minutes, and did the job anyway at 4 kilometers an hour. Courage is not the absence of the jaw. Courage is the 1,100 meters. She knelt over them behind the gate hut for a long time, and that was when I went and stood behind her, and I have already told what she said. But I have not told the rest of it, and the rest of it is the part I have gone back to most often, because it is the place where I could have changed everything and did not. She was looking at the fold of green plastic. It was a piece of a ration crate liner, the kind that comes wrapped around 100 tins of stewed meat, and it was folded around the packed clay of that device the way you would fold paper around a fish. And she turned it in the light with 1 finger and she said, "Not to me, not to anybody." 22nd. I said, "What's on the 22nd?" "Nothing," she said. "That's the point." She sat back on her heels. "This liner came off a crate that came off the barge. Every liner that comes off the barge goes in the burn pit behind the cookhouse, and the burn pit is inside our wire and it gets fired every second day. So this one was taken out of our burn pit on our side of the wire sometime after the 22nd of March, which is the last time we drew stewed meat. I remember the exact feeling of the ground going soft under me. You're saying somebody's been inside the wire. I'm saying somebody has been in the burn pit." She stood up. She wiped her hands down her thighs. "Which is 40 meters from where 300 men sleep, Warrant, and it is not a thing I want to say out loud in a tent full of officers who have decided I am a woman who likes attention." And there it was. She handed it to me. She stood there with silt in her teeth and blood in her hairline, and she handed me the single most important fact anybody discovered that entire spring. And she handed it to me, the Graves man, the man with the book, because I was the only officer on that gate who had not yet decided what she was. And I said, "God forgive me, and he has had 40 years to think it over," I said. "Then you should tell Major Lyle." She looked at me for about 2 seconds. "Yes," she said, "I should." And she picked up her case and she went and told Major Lyle. and Major Lyle wrote in his log that Staff Sergeant Vane had presented an unsupported theory of hostile penetration of the perimeter based on a piece of plastic sheeting, and that he had assessed it as speculative. And he read that line out at the board on the 12th, and 6 officers looked at the table. I could have carried it. That is the thing. I was a warrant officer with 6 years and a book that every man in that battalion was afraid of, and I could have walked into the colonel's tent and said, "Sir, I have looked at this myself and I believe her," and he might have listened to me, because I had no legend and no reputation, and nobody had ever accused me of believing my own press. I said, "You should tell Major Lyle," and I went inside and I wrote 2 names in pencil. They took her case on the 13th. It was Lyle's corporal who did it, a decent enough boy named Pruitt who has nothing to do with anything, and who I mention only because of the look on his face. He came to the vehicle park with a clipboard and a receipt book, because there is a receipt for everything in this army, including the taking of a woman's hands away from her, and Vane was sitting on the running board of a truck cleaning the probe. She stood up when she saw the clipboard. She knew what it was. "Staff Sergeant, I'm to inventory your case. It's in the HUD." She walked him over. She opened the case herself, and then she stood there with her hands at her sides, while a corporal she had never met counted her tools out onto a table and wrote them in a book. I was 20 feet away sorting effects, brights and deacons, the little canvas bags with a watch and a wallet and a letter in each, which was my work that afternoon, and I watched it. And I have never seen anything like it before or since, and I hope I never do. It took 40 minutes. He counted every item, and she named them for him because he did not know what half of them were. And so what happened in that hut for 40 minutes was that the finest bomb technician in that army stood at attention beside a table and taught a boy the names of her own tools while he took them off her. That's a non-ferrous hook. That's a second one. That's a set of ceramic snips, right ceramic, they'll bill me for steel. Yes, Staff Sergeant. That's a length of copper wire, 2 feet, and it isn't on any inventory anywhere, so you'll have to write it in yourself. Call it copper wire, 2 feet. It's mine. I made it. Yes, Staff Sergeant. That's a spanner. Pruitt looked at it. It was a spanner. It was a common half-inch open-ended spanner of the kind that is in every vehicle tool roll in the service, worn bright at the jaws, with a piece of black tape wrapped around the shaft. "Ma'am, that's just a spanner. That's not disposal equipment." "No," she said, "it isn't." And she reached out and she picked it up off the table and she put it in the top of her boot. And Pruitt, 20 years old, holding a clipboard, standing in a hut with a woman who had walked backward up a live chain in a valley. Pruitt looked at that spanner going into her boot, and he looked at his receipt book, and he made a decision that I would like to think I would have made, and I know I would not have. He did not write it down. 4 days later, on the belly of a sunken truck in the dark, in 6 feet of water, with nothing else in the world, Marisol Vane took a live charge off an axle with a common half-inch spanner that a corporal named Pruitt had decided not to see. I have thought about that more than almost anything else in this whole account. A whole army of procedure, and a board, and a colonel, and the entire weight of the service coming down on one woman to take her tools out of her hands, and the thing that saved 340 men got through the net, because a boy of 20 could not bring himself to write one word in a book. Grace comes in very small sizes. That is the only theology I have. The arrest lasted 70 minutes. That is another thing I have never seen written down anywhere, and it ought to be, because it is the ugliest hour I ever spent in uniform, and it belongs in the record with the rest of it. Ridgway gave the order at 1920 on the causeway. Staff Sergeant Vane is under arrest. Put a man on her. Bring her out with the last serial. And then he turned around and went west, because he had a battalion to move and a road that was filling with the sea, and he did not look back. And the order was carried out. That is the thing. That is what an army is. An order gets given by a frightened man on a road, and then it gets carried out faithfully by decent people, all the way down, and there is no point anywhere in the chain where somebody is allowed to say this is madness. The man they put on her was Private Ferris. He was 19. He was the same boy who 4 days later would put his head around the door of the gate hut and say, "Sir, there's something moving on the road," and he told me the whole of it afterward, and he cried while he told me, and I let him. They put a boy of 19 on her because there was nobody else. Everybody else was moving trucks. And Ferris came up to her on the stone in the dark with the water coming over the boots, and he did not know what to do with his rifle, and he did not know what to say, and in the end what he said was, "Staff Sergeant, the colonel says I'm to stay with you." And she said, "All right." That is all she said. She did not argue with him. She did not explain to him what she had just told the colonel, which was that the road he was standing on was going to open. She looked at him. "This is what he told me. This is his account, and I believe it." She looked at a 19-year-old private, and she made a professional judgment about him in about a second and a half, which is that he was going to do what he was told, and that nothing she could say would change that, and that if she frightened him, he would be less used to himself in what was coming. So she said, "All right," and she started walking west with the last cereal, with him beside her, and she spent the next 40 minutes doing the only thing left that she was permitted to do. She counted paces. Ferris told me this, and I did not understand it for years. He said she walked out with them in the dark and she was counting under her breath, and she was watching the men in front and she was counting, and at one point she stopped him with a hand on his arm and made the whole file behind them stop for about 8 seconds, for no reason he could see, and then let them go on. 8 seconds. She held 100 men on a road for 8 seconds, and nobody ever knew why. She knew where the fourth charge was. She could not tell them because nobody would take it from her, and she could not stop them because a colonel had said walk. And so she did the only arithmetic left available to a woman under arrest on a road that was about to kill her friends. She counted the paces, and she held the file, and she put 8 seconds of empty road between the men and the place she was afraid of. 19 men went in the water at the 900-meter mark. There would have been 30. Ferris never got over it. He was a haulage contractor for 40 years in a town up north, and he came to see me twice, once in 1971 and once when he was old. And both times he sat in that chair you are sitting in, and both times, sooner or later, he said the same sentence, and the sentence was, "I was her guard." And I said the same thing to him both times, which is the only thing there is to say. I said, "No, son, you were the last man she saved that anybody let her save." Halsey told me about the 4 hours on the truck. He told me in a hospital in the autumn, with the leg up in a frame and a window full of rain, and he was 26 years old, and he had been a mathematics student before the war, and he had the kind of mind that could not stop measuring things even when the thing being measured was the worst night of his life. The truck was on its side in the channel with the belly of it out of the water, about 4 feet of it, a rectangle of cold, wet steel the size of a kitchen table, tilted, and the tide was coming up under it at something over a foot an hour. He had a broken femur and a broken ankle, and he was in shock, and he was, by his own account, no use to anybody. "She got me up onto it," he said, "and I told her to go." "Did she answer?" "She said, 'In a minute.'" He laughed, and then he stopped laughing. "Warrant, she said it the way you'd say it to a man asking you to pass the salt. 'In a minute.' And then she sat down next to me, and she took her boot off, and she took her sock off, and she wrung it out, and she put it back on." "Why?" "Because wet feet is how you lose your feet," he said, "and she was planning to be out there for a while." That is vain. That is the whole of her, in one detail, on the belly of a sunken truck in the dark with the sea coming up. She wrung out her sock, because she had done the arithmetic on the next 11 hours, and the arithmetic included her feet. He said they talked. He said she made him talk, deliberately, to keep him from going under. She asked him what he had studied, and he told her, and she asked him to explain it, and he tried. And he said the strangest hour of his life was lying on a piece of steel in the middle of the sea in the dark, explaining to a staff sergeant of explosive ordnance disposal why some infinities are larger than other infinities. And she listened, and she asked good questions, and she was interested. And the whole time she was doing something with her hands in her lap that he could not see. What was she doing? She had the device off the axle, he said. The one she'd taken. She had it in her lap in the dark, and she was reading it, with her fingers, for 4 hours. And she was asking me about set theory, and she was reading a bomb in the dark with her fingers, and Warrant, I want you to understand something. He stopped. He looked out the window at the rain for a while. She never once let me see her check the water, he said. It was coming up under us all night, foot an hour. She must have known to the minute when we'd have to leave, and she never once looked down at it, not while I was awake, because if she'd looked down at it, I'd have looked down at it. 4 hours. She sat in the dark with her back to the sea and asked me about mathematics. And then Halsey said the thing that I have put on the front of everything I know about her, and I have never improved on it. He said, everyone talks about what she did on the road, but she carried me, and she cleared the road, and she asked me about infinity and Warrant. She did all 3 of those things with the same hands on the same night, and she never told anyone about the third one. I had to tell you. She'd have gone to her grave and never mentioned it. 11 devices. I said I would tell it, and I will tell it properly, because when men hear a number like that, they hear it as a feat, and it was not a feat. It was a shift. It was work. It was 11 hours of the hardest, slowest, most patient labor any human being has ever done on that coast, and the only way to honor it is to go through it one at a time the way she did. She reconstructed it for the board over 9 minutes in a flat voice, and I wrote it all down, and this is from my own hand. The first was at the neck, at the 2.5-mile mark, where the causeway climbs off the flats onto the rock. She got there at 4 in the morning on a falling tide with the water at her knees. It was under the weed in the seam of the road, and it was the one she had been describing to a colonel for 3 days without ever having seen it. It was armed. It had been armed since the 5th of April. She took it apart in the dark in 19 minutes. She said the hardest part was that her hands were too cold to feel the wire, and so she sat on them. I want to say that again. Standing in the sea at 4 in the morning with a live device between her feet, she sat down on her hands for 6 minutes to warm them, and then she got up and did the job. The second was 40 paces west. She found it because she was on her hands and knees by then, and had been for an hour, and she had learned that the way to read the road in the dark was not to look at it but to drag. She went along that causeway on all 4s with the palms of her hands flat, dragging them over the stone, feeling for the seam. That is where the hands went. 2.5 miles of it. The stone on the marrow is old, and it is set with shell and grit, and it is like a file. And by the middle of the morning she had no skin left across the heels of either palm, and she kept dragging, because the palms were the instrument, and there was no other instrument. The third was in the road bed, and she nearly missed it. She said she went over it once and stopped 40 feet on and came back, because something was wrong and she could not say what, and she went over it 4 times before she found it, and what was wrong was that there was a stone missing. Not moved. Missing. Somebody had lifted a stone out of that road to make room and had not put it back, and had filled the gap with packed clay, and in 11 days of walking that causeway with a steel probe, she had never once put the probe down in that particular square foot of ground, and so she had not known, but she knew the shape of the road, and the shape had a stone in it, and the stone was gone. The fourth was the one she had counted the paces to, the one she had held the file for. It was under the crust where the road had been undermined in the same manner as the truck, and she took it out at 6 in the morning with the gray just starting in the east, and she said at the board, flatly, no emphasis, the way she said everything she said. That one was 11 feet from where I stopped the file. I would like the record to show that Private Ferris did exactly as he was ordered and does not need to think about it. Two colonels wrote that down. It is in the file. She was under arrest on trial with her career finished, and she used her testimony to take the weight off a 19-year-old boy. The fifth was in the channel wall, and she went into the water to get it. The sixth was the barnacles. She told the board about the barnacles, and she had to explain it twice because they did not follow her. That a barnacle colony sits at a fixed height on a wall always, for the whole of its life. And if you see live barnacles above the tide line, then the wall did not grow them. The wall was rebuilt. Somebody took the stones out and put them back in the wrong order. And Major Lyle sat at the end of that table with his hand over his mouth, and I watched a 19-year professional understand that he had been outclassed by a kind of attention he did not possess and could not learn. And it was after the sixth that she turned around and went back for Halsey. She did not mention this at the board. She skipped it. She went from the sixth to the seventh in her account, and it was Halsey, months later, in a hospital bed, who told me there had been a mile and a half of tidal flat in between. Ridgway found out about it in October, from me, in a public house, because by then he was not a colonel anymore and I was not anybody's warrant officer, and we were two men in a room with a fire. I told him she went back a mile and a half against the tide, in the middle of the chain, to get Halsey off the truck. And he sat there for a long time, and then he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because the tide was coming and the truck would be under by 9. And Ridgway put his glass down on the table very carefully, exactly the way he had put his pencil down at the board on the 12th, and he said, "She had 4 devices left and 300 men on the wrong side of them, and she went a mile and a half backward for 1 corporal. Yes, that's not efficient. No, sir." And he said, and this is the last thing Colonel Ridgway ever said to me, and I have kept it, "Then she was better than I am, not braver, better. I would have made the correct decision, and I would have been wrong, and I have thought about that every day since April. The 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th she did with a man on her back. That is the fact. That is the fact that nobody can quite hold in their head, and I have watched people try in this room, in this chair, for 40 years. She put Corporal Halsey down on the stone, and she went forward, and she took a device out of a road, and she came back and picked him up, and she carried him past the place where the device had been, and she put him down, and she went forward again. 5 times. The 9th was the one she smelled. She was face down on the stone with the tide coming across it in sheets, and she smelled turned clay and stopped. The 10th was in the open, and she said it was the easiest of the 11, and it took her 40 minutes because by then her hands had stopped closing properly, and she had to work them with her teeth. And the 11th, the last one, the nearest one, the one lying 11 days deep in the ground 400 meters from our gate, under the boots of every man in that battalion, the first one they had laid, and the last one they would have armed. She took out at 10 minutes past 9 in the morning of the 15th of April, with 340 men standing on a wall watching her do it. They saw the whole thing. They could not see what it was. All they could see was a gray shape kneeling in the road with a broken man lying beside her, 400 meters out, not moving, for 22 minutes. 22 minutes. Nobody on that wall breathed. I was standing next to a colonel with his field glasses shaking in his hands, and behind me were 300 men who 4 days ago had watched this woman carry 2 bombs out of a road at 4 kilometers an hour, and had decided she was the reason their friends were dead. And now every single one of them was standing on a wall in the gray morning, silently begging her not to die. And at 9:11 she stood up. She stood up and she bent down, and she got Halsey across her shoulders, and she started walking. I have one more thing, and then I am done. 6 weeks after, when the boards were over and she had been cleared and the battalion had been broken up and sent to 4 different places the way battalions are, I saw her one last time. She was on the pier at the Marrow with her 2 green bags and her case, waiting for the barge, and it was raining, and there was nobody else there. I went down. I did not have anything to say to her. I had been trying to think of something for 6 weeks, and I had not found it. She was looking at the water, same as the first day. I said, "Staff Sergeant." "Warrant." And then I stood there and the rain came down, and I opened my mouth twice and shut it twice, and finally what came out was not what I meant to say at all. What came out was, "I wrote you down." She did not turn around. "I know," she said. "In the book on the 14th, I put you in the book." "I know you did." She said it perfectly evenly. "That was your job. You'd have been wrong not to." And I said, and my voice was not steady, and I was a 41-year-old man, and I was not able to help it, I said, "I took you back out." And Marisol Vane turned around on that pier in the rain and looked at me. And for the only time in the whole 11 weeks that I knew her, something moved in her face. She said, "Then that's the best thing anyone did for me on this coast, and I'd be obliged if you'd let me shake your hand." And I put my hand out and she took it, and her hand was hard and dry and cold, and the palm of it was a ruin all across the heel of it, one long unhealed seam where the road had been, and she did not flinch, and I did not let go too quickly. Then the barge came, and she picked up her bags and she went. And that is why, when they ask me, and they still ask me, even now, even at 81, they come from the schools and the papers and they sit where you are sitting, and they ask me what it was like to see it. The salute, the colonel's hand that would not come down, 340 men coming to attention on a wall with no order given. That is why I tell them that they are asking about the wrong morning. The salute was the 15th. Anybody can salute. A whole battalion can come to attention in the gray light, and it costs them nothing but the noise of their boots. The morning that matters is the 14th, at 2:30, in a hut, with a pencil in my hand and the sea on the wall outside, when I wrote missing, presumed dead in a book because I had left her, and every one of us had left her, and it was the correct decision, and it was written down properly, in the proper column, in the proper hand. That is the morning I would have back. You do not get it back. That is the whole lesson of a long life, and it can be said in 6 words, and everybody has to learn it alone anyway. But there is one thing you can do, and it is small, and it is the only thing I have ever been proud of. When you find out you were wrong about somebody, go and get the eraser.